And you'll remember on Monday that we heard from Iona Datta, and she really talked about this idea of using research as a vehicle for intervening in ICT development. And then yesterday we had a really interesting policy panel with Narmeen and Andres and David, and they talked about the different ways that policymakers, particularly at the European level, are trying to address sustainability through ICT in various ways. And today we'll build upon that conversation and really talk about kind of the intricacies of practice. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Barnes here. Sarah is joining us from Sydney. It's evening there, I'm guessing. But Sarah is a researcher and a strategist and a storyteller, and she works at this intersection of public culture and digital futures and creative communities. She's done a lot of work on smart cities and digital platforms, and she's engaged in transdisciplinary collaboration with the public sector, with the private sector, with academia, with civil society. And she's really working towards using ICT to create inclusive and creative and sustainable worlds. So I would encourage you to go to Sarah's website, Sarah Barnes, .me, where she's got an extensive amount of material. And I had approached Sarah a couple of months ago about this, and I said, wouldn't it be great to talk about your book, Platform Urbanism, which came out in 2020? And she said that would be fantastic. I know it's been 2 years since you published the book. You're probably slightly tired of talking about it, but at the same time, there's always more things to discuss. But then we also said, well, I think it would be really interesting to talk about what you've done since you published the book and the work that you've been doing as a strategist, as a storyteller, and really generate this conversation around strategic interventions in ICT and sustainability. So we've got about 60 minutes where we can chat, and I was going to start us out. I've got a series of questions that I sent to Sarah in advance. And I told Sarah, let's have a kind of a generative, informal conversation here. We'll do that for maybe 20, 25 minutes, and then we can open it up to the audience and see if we can get some other questions. So please, whether you're online or whether you're in real life there in Plovdiv, please start thinking about ideas of things that you want to ask Sarah, or some different comments that you want to make, because hopefully this can be a collective conversation. So welcome, Sarah. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we could start out and you could just give us a very brief summary of your background. I talked to you earlier and I said, you're a geographer, right? You said, yeah, that's more or less right. But yeah, can you tell us about your background?
Yes, I came to realize kind of quite late in the piece that I was a geographer. My original undergraduate was politics and international relations, but I quickly moved into the field of digital policy as essentially a graduate in our federal government, looking at essentially information policy, telecommunications policy, and the like. This was a really exciting role for me as a young grasshopper, if you like, learning about the ways of the world, not just the sort of political theories, but getting into the nuts and bolts of policy making for a future digital economy. But I quickly realized that the powers that be around policy making and the extent to which there was going to be a radical response to some of the challenges that we as a society would be facing in a world in which we live in a kind of broadband convergent era kind of world, were not really being addressed by government. So I moved out into practice, into independent research at a research think tank around, it was called Network Insights, around future media and telecommunications. I then moved on to broadcasting policy, but very quickly realized that we had this emerging issue to do with 4G or 3G at the time, 3G phones, which were suddenly going to be changing the way that we interacted in the environment and in the cities that we found ourselves. Having sort of grown up in an institute for sustainability and technology policy, my father was a sustainability professor, so I grew up with all these ideas. I instantly thought about that intersection between immersive and, if you like, pervasive digital technologies and their interface with the city. So I started research, leaving my policy and strategy roles, started research again like 2005, I guess, or 8. I started researching real-time cities at that point, and then later moved on to do more postdoctoral research as well in that field, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of the book. But I guess that background has meant that I've always been policy, practice, and research. So I don't distinguish very much between them. I mean, there's certainly different sectors involved. You know, I do digital practice, I advise and do policy and strategy, and research is really fundamental to all of that. So that's just a little bit of a potted background.
Great. No, that's very helpful. So why don't we jump into your book? So your book, the title of it is Platform Urbanism, Negotiating Platform Ecosystems in Connected Cities. And it was published in 2020 by Palgrave Macmillan. And it's gotten really good traction. I was looking on Google Scholar. Everybody goes to Google Scholar, right, and looks at citations. And in 2 years, you've gotten over 150 citations to the book. So, I mean, it's certainly something within the whole platform research field. It's central to that. So congratulations on that. I was wondering, there's maybe a few people here that haven't read your book. Everybody probably has, but just in case, can you give us just a snapshot of your motivation for writing it and basically, you know, kind of the overarching argument of the book?
Sure. There's two slightly separate questions, so I'll answer them in turn. So my motivation for writing it, I guess, emerged in around 2012, 2013, actually. So you can see there it did take a while for the actual book to be published. Involved a lot of case study work in the meantime. But at that time, and interestingly for this conversation, I was leading a digital strategy for our broadcasting corporation dealing with emergencies and the role of the public broadcaster in supporting communities during emergency periods through digital technology. And I was really conscious of the important role of open data at that time, but also a lot of entrepreneurs who were talking about wanting to make a platform play. This was this term they used into different sectors, like the way in which they could essentially grab a market share through a platform and dominate that market. And it was very much the language of digital entrepreneurship at the time. This was around 2013, I recall. And I just immediately kind of went, oh, wow, this is going to, it was an aha moment of just kind of like, wow, the city, like, we're going to have like platform cities. That's going to happen. Like that infrastructure is going to be managed as a platform before we know it. And all kinds of services are going to be run as platforms. And kind of untangling what that meant for the role of government, what that meant for citizen experiences and relationships with each other, with government, and the kind of regulatory environments around those, like huge issues. And it actually took me quite a few years. And there were books that came out after this, obviously, you know, platform society, platform capitalism, and so forth. And they were, you know, I was thinking through these at the same time, but specifically with an urban lens, which is slightly different. And the reason it's different is because it's actually looking, and for those of us who are kind of urban geographers or come from that geography lens, it's the productivity, it's the productive role of platforms in actually reconstituting urban behavior and urban relations that is so fundamental. It's not a kind of, you know, just impacting on, but actually reconstituting all kinds of relations. And so, yeah, I guess that, as I came to it, and so to go to your second part of that question, Andy, the overarching argument is really that digital platforms are significant in cities, not just because they're digital, but because they reformulate relationships between different entities in important ways. Not all of them are new, and not, and some of them are enabled by technology, but not only technology. I think it's just that's why I guess I use that word platform or phrase platform ecosystem, because it's kind of intended to capture these different kinds of relationalities that are put into play through platforms.
Great. I mean, I think one of the other things that you emphasize in the book that's important, the urban aspect of it, is the materiality, is the physical aspect of platforms, which maybe some of the other platform work doesn't emphasize that materiality as much, and it becomes very apparent when you look at cities that are being platformed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's where I guess I found the geography lens to be very helpful, because it actually keeps you sensitive to and focused on material relations, but also the kind of productive and even infrastructural environments that are shifting, and thinking about them as platforms, because that's increasingly the way that many entities are thinking about them as well. So to me, it's the significance. We often, and I'm one of these people who studied for a long time, as you heard, essentially from like the early 2000s, digital and its impact on society. And for so long, we had this sort of the metaphor was the network, and the idea of networks as being porous, as being free-flowing data. Data was free to flow in these new ways, very decentered, very much bottom-up environments. And that, I guess I'm really conscious that that metaphor of networks actually allowed for a whole lot of, I now think, a lot of damage to be done, because it kind of essentially allowed us to think, and we've seen this with social networks, we allowed us to think, well, actually, if we're participating in these platforms, we're going to be networked together, and that's going to allow this free-flowing or new kinds of, whether it's digital relations or other kinds of value sharing relations. But in fact, when we weren't thinking about the data structures that underpinned these networks, the focus on what power was being accreted, if you like, was not there. So I guess it's that's where, I think it's rightly so that we've shifted attention towards a metaphor like platform away from network for a time. I think we need to move on, if we like, soon, hopefully, from platforms. But it is important to understand, I guess, the power relations that are established through digital platforms. And it might be a good time, Andy. You mentioned you wanted to get up a little figure.
Yeah.
Whether now is the time.
Can you see that?
Yes, I can see that. Can others see that? I hope so. This, so Andy kindly kind of pulled this out from the book, and it's the basic kind of summation of what is distinctive about platforms, and also about what is different to the idea of the network. Platforms have been around for a very long time. There's lots of debates around, well, hang on, but platforms aren't new, and we've had newspapers were platforms, and dating sites or markets, in a sense. Any market is a platform, in the sense that it allows for multi-sided kind of interactions that are about value exchange. So that's a basic form of what's in this language, is intermediation, platform intermediation. And then the kind of era of almost the kind of net utopian ideas around networks were that, well, in fact, if we can get more people interacting and sharing on on platforms. And I'm not talking in specific companies, but I guess, we all know the kind of companies that we're talking about here in terms of the Ubers and the Airbnbs and the Amazons and so forth. The initial ways in which they were sold was this idea that, anyone who's on the platform, if you've got your house, if you've got a spare room, you can generate greater value yourself. It empowers you. If we move towards more of a sharing environment for say cars and car sharing, we can do away with the idea of ownership. But we can also essentially create new value out of forms of asset ownership that are undervalued. So this idea of kind of value creation that is allowed through platforms was really important in a sense for a period, and continues to be. But what is and what's become difficult, and I guess what's led to much of what we kind of now understand as the tech lash and many more problems around platforms is that there are interactions that take place in ways that also generate lots and lots of data. And that data is not necessarily shared in ways that reflect the different forms of value creation and the different participants of that value creation. So we've seen essentially that, there's policies whereby, on the basis of often privacy in particular, that no data can be shared. So the platform operator essentially is able to capture that data. And that means that, in a sense, they are able to capture more knowledge and information about various kinds of activities in any kind of marketplace, and that we are seeing greater asymmetries of data use and data access as a consequence. And it's essentially the data policies and the data infrastructures around around data exchange that mean that platforms have been able to grow at the rate that the world has never seen before.
Yeah, no, great. No, I one of the things that is really interesting to me, legal scholars use this term regulatory entrepreneurialism. You may have heard that before, but basically the way that platform companies like Airbnb and Uber work is they try to find new ways of creating value creation. And then, local government or national government recognizes problems with that. For instance, with Uber not wanting to do background checks on their drivers and saying, oh, we're not a taxi service. We're actually just an intermediary here. So, we're not going to be following the existing regulatory frameworks. And so it feels like governments are always trying to catch up with the work that platform companies are doing. Basically, they do something that's quasi illegal, and then they wait until the regulations catch up, and then they jump forward in front of that. Is that something that you're seeing with platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, over this period of years, you're right. It's about 10 years coming up to that I've been studying these platforms. And it's incredible how I've seen how misunderstood platform ecosystems are, and as a consequence, how they should be regulated and governed. And I think, we are obviously and particularly in the last, I'd say 2 to 3 years, seeing that change. But that's where I in reflecting on the growth of platforms, particularly since 2008, I came to see that, in a sense, these organizing metaphors do a lot of the work. So the idea of the network did a lot of the work of platforms in introducing companies like Airbnb and Uber into cities. The idea that value could be shared, freely, which in some senses it is, but in fact weren't accompanied by stricter policies around how data could be used. Yeah.
And then I guess then the question becomes, is there a potential for reform, and what this conference is about is steering ICT towards sustainability, whether that means, environmental protection or economic prosperity or social equity. And I think you start to hint at this in the final chapter of your book, in ways that we can try to steer and influence platforms. But do you see any hope here? Is this, are we just going to be ruled by the digital overlords here in the coming years, and there's not much that we can do except just criticize them? But are there ways that we can make platforms more progressive, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. There's a huge amount that is happening. I think the EU is really leading the way in terms of responding proactively to issues around data sharing, and particularly business to business data sharing. So when you kind of understand that it's essentially, platforms are able to commoditize the value creation generated on their, through activities, through apps that we all use daily. If that data is commoditized only by one business, that's a problem. If there are new mandates that require the operation of that business, the licensing of that business, if that license or regulatory framework can include mandates around data sharing, then the playing field starts to be leveled. And they are changes that are happening. That's a focus area. So the EU data strategy and the EU Data Act are both really important new frameworks, and I think I'm really interested in that space. It's important to understand that I guess there's been a lot of work around data collaboration and public-private data collaboratives and so forth, and I think that the key impact area is actually in seeing that within licenses to operate for a number of these platforms, that it actually needs to be at that level, rather than a kind of let's invite do good platforms to collaborate and see what we can come up with. Like it's a much stronger regulatory regime that is needed to make this happen. But there is a lot that I see happening at the moment in that data sharing space that is significant. The second thing I was going to say in response to the question, Andy, was I guess what I try to do in the book is to show the emergence of platforms and platform ecosystems. Yes, the way that they've been developed by private platform companies, but I think understanding their dynamics is really important for any entity that is wanting to operate digitally, and that includes those that are committed to public value outcomes and sustainability outcomes. And so in a sense, like I know, yes, platform urbanism as a book is critical of platforms, but it's actually kind of saying to be operating in a digital world, we all need to think in terms of platforms. But what does that look like, say from a sustainability perspective, from a resilience perspective? What would designing a platform ecosystem look like, targeting specific resilience or SDG kind of goals? How could a platform mindset be used to facilitate more data collaboration and I guess more strategic interest in different kinds of data sources that could be brought into play? And to me, if you don't mind me just talking about that point a little bit further, the fundamental thing that a platform mindset kind of means is that and this I've been talking about this today in a conference. Open data, for example, putting your data out there, sharing it. We've seen that doesn't necessarily go anywhere. You actually need to have an ecosystem of relationships, partners, users that each themselves can see the benefit for themselves for engaging in this work. And that's work that often doesn't get done, particularly when you're talking about ICT and digital. If it's done for, say, from a government perspective, there's a sense that, build it and they will come, if you like. So thinking about the relationalities and the forms of value that are built up around a platform is really important. And I guess that's where I see it's not necessarily, yes, the corporate side and the data capture and commoditization side of platforms is problematic, but I don't think platforms are going away anytime soon.
Yep. No, that's great. Well, I mean, maybe this is a nice segue into your current role as a strategist, and really trying to facilitate different stakeholders, whether they're from the private sector or the public sector, or from academia or from civil society, and trying to get them networked. So it feels to me like you're kind of positioning yourself as an intermediary in the ICT world. Is that a fair way to talk about your work as a strategist?
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah. I think someone recently, I'm a mentor to organizations, and someone used the word digital doula recently. And I thought that's actually kind of nice, because I'm often working at I can work across different levels of decision making, but it's actually about being an enabler rather than necessarily pushing a specific, strategy or particular methodology. It's more about guiding people through thinking through some of their different stakeholders and some of the different ways of building partnerships and building capacity, but using digital. Another point, I guess, is that I've spent a lot of time in academia and in research, and it's absolutely fundamental to all my work. But I guess I enjoy the work of working with community and working with really kind of tangible on the ground, to use that phrase, issues, which is where I think it's where a lot of change can be affected. And sometimes when you're only doing research, you kind of have this expectation that the world sort of needs to be different, and why doesn't the world conform to this ideal model that we think it should be? And ultimately, all of this stuff is actually about the delivering and the capacity to be realized. So that difficult work of delivering is something that I think I enjoy it, but it's also, I think, important to do.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes me think about sort of the speed of things. And I mean, I think we're notorious in academia for doing things very slowly, and then we talk to activists on the ground, or we talk to policymakers, and they're like, well, we're going to do this tomorrow. We say, well, we can come back to you for a meeting in 3 months, and then, we can have a conference in 2 years. And, so do you sense a different pace of change when you're working as a strategist versus as an academic?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting. It's a really interesting line of questioning. I think that what I've found is that it's sometimes in academia you can almost go too far into the future as well. There's a kind of like you can see where things are going to be, and research gets focused at that point, which may be, in fact, like the time horizon may be too far from where a lot of decisions, and even policymakers may be at currently. And that kind of means that by the time a field or a problematic kind of actually, like, say, blows up, people like academics have moved on. So, and it's kind of like, wait, yes, this whole field may be kind of out of fashion in a research sense, but it's actually still quite significant. And I'm talking there, I have to confess, about the smart cities field, where from an urban geography and geography perspective, it's like there's a lot of criticism around it for very good reason, and it's also not a particularly kind of, I don't know if you agree, Andy, but not a particularly fashionable space if you started to do research in smart cities today. But at the same time, there's many city leaders are always grappling with this challenge, and you kind of, this term digital doula, I like to kind of be able to, don't say hold their hand, but be there to sort of work with them through some of these challenges. Yeah.
Okay. And when you're working with your clients, I was wondering if you could reflect on, are there pinch points or particular barriers? Is it that there's not a level of technical expertise that's needed to actually do this type of work? Is it that people don't care? I mean, I sort of feel like when I talk to my mother about this, or some of my relatives, they're like, yeah, platforms, who cares? That's fine. I'll just shop at Amazon, that's fine. And I'm like, really? Is it that there's an overemphasis on profit? Is it a lack of imagination? I mean, are there barriers, or are there particular challenges that you confront as a strategist that you think are interesting?
Yeah, I would say I confront all of those challenges. One big challenge, perennial challenge, is that those who are most interested in ICT and technology, particularly in the business environment and the policy environment, are often the techno evangelists, who can see no critical issues really, and will often be either selling product, vendor oriented, or kind of fairly starry-eyed about the work that they're doing and its potential impact. And those who are critical and maybe see ICT through a more political lens are often far less educated about actually ICT itself and the complexities of actually working in those industries. So there's this kind of, it's a weird gap. If you are immersed in the sector, then you may not be have that kind of, I think, critical perspective that can be needed. And I mean, I would say that probably what distinguishes me from a lot of others is that I do always see things through the lens of public value, and the ways in which the idea of democracy and the idea of the public is being reconstituted always through technology, and that we don't have we don't have the answers, but technology and ICT is always a really political space to be operating in. So understanding values and what values underlie engagement with ICT is, that's my, dare I say, North Star. That's another consulting term, by the way.
North Star.
Yeah. Yeah. Consultants are always talking about the North Star.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's helpful. So maybe a flip side to that question is have you in your strategy work, have you, I'm sure you have, but have you developed surprising and inspiring ways that you've started to engage civil society groups or the public sector with ICT in new ways? Have things come up where you said, wow, this is great, they've actually, we're getting this, and we're so not sort of the negatives, but more the positives.
I think it's an answer to your question. The big kind of practical focus that's where I've tried to put in place a number of these ideas around platform ecosystems for a more kind of civil society outcome is a project I've been leading myself for the last couple of years. It's called Storybox Places is the full name, and it's kind of rethinking outdoor media in terms of public space media. Outdoor media is another sort of fascinating area where we're seeing huge amounts of, AI for one, but a lot of IoT and sensors and platforms kind of coming in and just completely disrupting the industry. And we're seeing a lot of, facial recognition technologies being introduced, and a huge amount of, algorithmic governance. And in cities like the one I live in, which is Sydney, there's a huge amount of screens as well. And the business cases behind why these screens operate are clearly, you know, they're working, they're successful. But there's no conversation around why this kind of technology isn't used for public good to support different kinds of engagement with citizens outdoors. So I've kind of been rethinking the platform model in that space, but for citizens. And what's been interesting is bringing on partnerships and saying, you know, we have all kinds of organizations who will be producing digital content or need digital for communities, and actually saying, well, why not build an infrastructure that is open, but facilitate partnerships through that, so that rather than all these entities doing their own thing, we have a common platform to communicate outdoors. And that's something that's, you know, been very successful so far in terms of attracting those. It's totally nonprofit. It's, you know, it's nonprofit media, arts, environmental organizations, community organizations, sponsored by government as well. So that that's an example of where, I guess, yeah, it's kind of playing with the platform design model in ways that produce civic and public value is possible at different levels.
Great. No, that's really, really inspiring. I want to open it up to the audience, but let me just end with a final question to you. When we were communicating by email, you said, oh, you know, I'm going to be in the coming years, I'm starting a collaboration, and I'm going to be working with researchers at the University of Melbourne at the Center for Cities. And we're going to be working on ICT. I said, oh, so what are you guys going to do? So, and I know it's very early days, but what's the future agenda going to be with University of Melbourne Center for Cities?
Yeah, it is a little early days, but I guess some of the conversations that we're interested in, one is really about building that digital capacity and that digital literacy amongst city leaders. So there's quite a focus on what does it mean to be a city leader in this day and age, and what are the kinds of tools and approaches that and strategies that are needed that reflect the kind of public purpose and mission-driven innovation approach. So this is really moving from kind of ICT for ICT's sake and having a much stronger focus on aligning strategy around mission and value. So that's a kind of really practical kind of area, I feel like. I am very interested in the whole urban AI agenda, as are many people. And I guess that sort of plays into the ways in which digital and ICT is a really important interface for local resilience, actually, community resilience. Where you know, and the last year or 6 months or 3 months in Australia have certainly been a reminder just how fast we are being impacted by climate change and disasters and disaster preparedness, and kind of thinking through, well, you know, the role of government in disaster-prone areas and what is the place of ICT. There is a lot of work to be done there. So I'm developing partnerships with ULI is one entity, the Urban Land Institute, as an Asia Pacific Resilient Cities Product Council. So we're sort of looking at that field of resilience and the sort of ways in which a data strategy can be supported for a range of different local and state and federal government entities that progress that conversation. So they're just some of the kind of current talking points. I wouldn't say it's a full agenda, but that might be helpful in terms of, you know, some of those who are in the audience today and some of the potential directions that we could explore. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. I want to open it up. Please, either online audience or IRL audience there, if you have a question or comment or want to raise a new point of inquiry, please do it now. Corral, do you have any hands raised there? I don't see anybody's hands raised, but I've got a hand here online. Ian, please.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for such an interesting talk. I'm Ian Brooks from the University of the West of England. You mentioned the damage that the fashion for network thinking had done in terms of hiding the acquisition of power. And this seems to be a frequent story around tech and ICT, the failure to anticipate impacts. Well, perhaps that's willful, but what are the best examples that you've seen or methods that you've worked with to improve our impact assessment, impact foresight?
A good question. I'm just thinking, the issue around networks is a kind of underlying point, that there is a kind of persistent optimism around the role of technology in society. So I think what you're saying is when do we see the impact in terms of potential negative impact be addressed in a planning stage of a project? Or
yes, when thinking about launching a project, how do we make sure that we get a balanced assessment of the impacts, particularly not to be led by the techno-evangelists and the marketers?
Yeah, I don't, in terms of negative impact, it's a great question, because I don't know of a project that sets out and says these are the potential risks associated with adopting ICT, or technology in this instance. The kind of, well, if we did this option versus this, these are our risks. I haven't seen that, and that's a very interesting kind of line of reasoning. But I would say that what you do see increasingly in that, and I work a lot in the city space, is there is a much stronger focus on that mission-driven innovation perspective. I'm talking here about the work of Mariana Mazzucato, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I've just co-authored a paper with the Institute, and that kind of shifting away from, this is not a technology project. This is about urban heat. This is what the project is about. Let's think about the tools and resources that we can draw on to deliver that. So let's say it's actually quite a new way of thinking, putting innovation kind of at the service, technology innovation at the service of these goals. Because we've had many, like more than a decade, 2 decades of a very different approach that puts technology outcomes at the center. I'm sorry, I can't think of an example.
I think that just goes to show the point. As a geographer, you'll know any large construction projects will need an environmental impact assessment, but you can make a system go viral globally with little intention about consequences.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Other questions or comments?
We have a question here, Andy.
Okay.
Thank you. It's Thibaut from UC Louvain speaking. Thanks a lot for the talk. I will have one question that is built on a personal impression, so I might be completely wrong. So please tell me if it's the case just after the question. I would tend to be a kind of trend in policy making, pushing towards like tech or ICT solutions, more because like of a buzzword or like hype thing around innovation for the sake of innovation, more than because it is really relevant. To decrease impact and for sustainability thing. So my question would be, how far, in your opinion, are policymakers to able to choose non-technological solution that could lead to rapid slash in sustainability impact, compared to technological solution, which are often brought forward with like innovation or that kind of stuff. I don't know if it's clear, but yeah, thanks.
No, it's a good question, and it follows on well from the last point, that we do see a reliance on technology solutions. I think Evgeny Morozov used the phrase solutionism, where sort of technology is the solution to any difficult question. But I think that when I listen to your question, I would say on the one hand, I'm unfortunately slightly not the best person to ask, because my specialism is in looking at reframing the way we use ICT towards a more focus on those those missions or particular civil or sustainability or resilience outcomes. So I'm doing that work to reframe digital and ICT in that way. But of course, you know, there are huge sectors that are not that focused on the ICT. And I mean, I even just think about, you know, finance and markets. And, you know, even if you just look at the role of trading, carbon trading schemes, or, you know, any, you know, these are kinds of ways of orchestrating markets in ways that I wouldn't say that they foreground technology per se, but they actually foreground price, for example. That is still quite a sort of technocratic kind of space to be operating in, but I think there are many examples where technology is not foregrounded. But I think that it's really critical that we do really challenge how technology becomes foregrounded as well. What do you think, Andy?
I think there's an interesting note in that question about, you know, why don't we consider the non-technological solution or non-technological approach first and then move to the technological approach. But there's a sexiness, you know, there's this aura around technology that we just sort of automatically go towards that.
And I have a lecture that thank you. And I have a lecture I give where you know, it was actually at the time of, you know, the crypto sort of craze last year, which was all kind of turning crypto for good. You know, how can we use NFTs for good? New kinds of trading, and this particular person was like, actually what we need to all do is put our screens down and walk around and talk to each other, and actually that would potentially do a whole lot more good than rewiring kind of NFT and crypto systems. Like, why are we doing this again? And I love that line. Yeah.
Exactly. If I may, that's related to this, that a bit while I was asking the question, because you mentioned you were strategic and like how we can reformulate this. And so my question was a bit more, when you are doing this, is there a place, like a space before getting into the how can we reformulate this with ICT, asking the question, how could we do it without ICT? And then if ICT is the only solution that can really make it work, then we go for that. But that was like the pre-assumption question that I was targeting and when I asked for the strategic thing. Sorry if it wasn't clear.
I think it's a great, I think it's a great point. I really like it. I won't disagree with you.
Good. Coral, do we have other comments or questions from the audience there?
No, they are not.
Francis, I see online has a question or comment. Francis, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow the question of Thibault, because what do you think of the risk of platforms breaking down, falling down, and then we have to see what are the fallback solutions for rendering the service that was rendered by the platform?
I see this as a really huge challenge and a huge issue for coming decades. I mean, I've just in some of the local conversations I've just been having today, there's, you know, increasingly so many, we have local governments in Australia which are really quite small governing entities, and some of those are only just now starting to put their government data on the cloud, and they say the reason why they've started to do this is because of floods, and because they're now at a point where they actually may completely lose their buildings at any minute. And, you know, then of course, well, where is that data being stored, and what's the storage, and will the storage also get flooded? The physical breakdown of many of these complex systems is something to be, you know, taken quite seriously. What are the redundancies there, and what are the risks of reliance on these systems? I think is a huge part of ICT for sustainability as a field in coming years, including this year. Yeah. But, you know, we also know that I guess it's about that multi-leveled engagement, isn't it? You know, the stuff that I've discussed relating to the book was about having a more you know, intelligent and historically informed understanding of how platforms operate in order to try to, you know, re-engineer them in some way. But it's not to say that there aren't kind of ways that need to kind of move outside of those platform ecosystems and ways of working that are necessarily outside of those. So it's always good to bring that perspective to the fore. Another question.
Yeah, do you want me to read? There's a question here in the chat from Ashok. He says, in your experience, do you see some kinds of resistance to being cautious with ICT? When you talk to people or governments or stakeholders who are at the moment underserved by ICT solutions. For example, how easy or hard is it to nudge the Indian government or an African nation away from unsustainable ICT solutions that they might be interested in?
Yeah, I think there is resistance, or certainly a lack of understanding of the risks. Ayana Datta's work is very interesting in this space as well, working with Indian smart cities. Yeah, that she does work looking at all the needs. This is a paper I saw her present a couple of years ago. The needs of women in I don't remember the city, but Indian communities, and all of the needs that they had, and where government was spending money on smart city strategy. And it's really, really a shame to see that. But that's where, you know, technology and ICT solutions are, they're also very much wrapped up with business improvement and building entrepreneurial cultures, and that is often why they're done. It's not really a technology strategy; it's a business strategy wrapped up as a technology strategy. So there's sometimes some of the reasons why I think we do see that resistance to being cautious with ICT, particularly amongst government stakeholders whose job it is to build effective business ecosystems.
Sarah, I was wondering, so I mean, since you've been engaged in smart cities and platforms for such a long time, and my sense is that, you know, it started out as this very sort of tech-driven approach, and then we start to see this confluence of tech and green. And, you know, the idea that we can use digital technologies to, you know, protect the environment or to combat climate change or to decarbonize. And more recently, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, we've started to talk about smart citizenship, you know, and putting people first, you know, and smart with a heart and all these types of things. So we've seen very rapidly, we've seen a real change, you know, from maybe 2010 to date, that we've started to take on board, you know, sustainability with respect to environment, but then also with respect to social equity and people. So in some ways, I think we should be kind of optimistic and happy. It's maybe not happening as quickly as we'd like it to, but I mean, you can't really talk about smart cities today. You can't talk about digitalization and not talk about people. And some of it is empty rhetoric, I realize, but there is something to that, don't you think? That with the, you know, this idea of smart citizenship. So I think we don't have to be completely pessimistic.
No, I agree, and I have seen those changes, and we've seen some really significant moves. I mean, the most recent paper is a working paper with Raina Cattell and Francesca Bria and Fernandez Mong from the UCL IIPP. Sorry, that's a lot of names, but that was looking at the Barcelona case study, which is one of the, you know, most significant cities to move from that really privatized, you know, very much techno-utopian smart city model to one that was very citizen-led. It came through, you know, a wave of citizen-led reform. And that wave, you know, even if it's not maintained necessarily the momentum that it had, nevertheless has put in place a whole lot of building blocks that many other cities can work with, and also really created that different kind of narrative around you know, issues around data sovereignty and data commons as well. But I do think it is important, and probably no more so than in the space of sustainability, where, you know, ICT has a place. It certainly has a place. It's not necessarily the first thing, and I think everyone in the room is aware of that. But having said that, we all carry around intelligent devices, you know, and we all are completely immersed in digital technology all the time. So it's pretty hard to walk away from the scene and say it doesn't matter to you know, the future of the planet and to how we relate to each other on this planet. Yep.
Thank you. So we're quickly running out of time here, but really enjoyed the conversation. Maybe just a last parting words. Sarah, do you have any advice for those of us that are trying to intervene and trying to steer ICT towards sustainability? Any nuggets of wisdom that you've gotten from being a strategist, from being a researcher, from putting this Platform Urbanism book out there that you think that we should all try? I know there's no silver bullet solutions here, but any thoughts, any words of wisdom for us?
You didn't tell me you're going to ask that question, and that one's a new one. Look, it's a good question. So, you know, first of all, it's, you know, ICT, it's obviously a tool, and part of what I've tried to do with the Platform Urbanism work is to elevate the different relationships that are orchestrated through platforms. And so in terms of your work, yes, technology is there, and data curation and understanding more diverse sources of data than you think. We live in data-rich worlds. There's the data that can be instrumented from individual sensors, but there's all kinds of other data sources. Sure, so there's that data layer, but I guess it's really the relationships and the way that relationships are reformulated is really important to this story. So, you know, with the ICT focus, I would encourage you to think about the kinds of relationships that are embodied across these different forms of technology as being really a priority to your work. I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no. So we started out talking about networks, and you're saying, no, we don't need to talk about networks. We need to talk about relations, right? So, and maybe those seem to be the same thing, but no, I think that's really helpful. So
the difference is that, you know, that actually the ways in which relationships are structured through platforms are more important than ever. So,
yep, great. No, that's wonderful. Well, please help me in thanking Sarah for a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.